Hey, welcome everybody to Power Hour. I'm Jim Breslo, your host for today, and we've got a great guest on Power Hour. It is Joel Gilbert, who is a conservative Angelino, kind of like me. We're a very small group here, but a vocal group. And Joel, it's great to see you again. I think I interviewed you one time before about your book about the Trayvon Martin case, and now, or sorry, I should say a documentary, right?
Correct.
Yeah. And Joel is a documentary filmmaker on a lot of very interesting and controversial subjects. And he's got one coming out very soon that I think everybody is going to be very interested in, especially considering a political climate today and the election of Trump. And among the many issues that are going to be at the forefront is going to be the whole climate change cult out there, and Trump's how Trump is going to address it, and pulling out the Paris Climate Accords is no doubt something he'll probably do on day one. So your movie's coming out at a very interesting time that could end up being somewhat influential in the public's thinking about climate change as Trump takes office. So Joel Gilbert, welcome to Power Hour.
Okay, thanks. Great to be back with you.
And I do have to address also one of the things that you've done a number of documentaries on Bob Dylan, is that right?
Yeah, I started out actually made several documentaries on Bob Dylan's career and life history, and those films still do very well because Bob Dylan is iconic figure in music and literature in American history, and he's still touring to this day. So my Bob Dylan films, I think, looked into his history and music the way no one ever has looked into it before.
Well, who's also touring still is his protege, Bruce Springsteen. And I just returned from Vancouver, where I saw his last show of this tour. So I'm a huge Springsteen fan, but you can't be a Springsteen fan without also being a Bob Dylan fan. Dylan, I probably saw in concert the last time about 10 years ago. Have you seen him recently in concert?
I did see Dylan recently at the Hollywood Bowl, and he's got a small kind of quartet with him. It's almost looks like a jazz band, and he just goes through most of his older hits mostly, and he's still got it. I have trouble relating to Bruce Springsteen's music because he's such a radical leftist, so that kind of diminishes the Springsteen vibe for me.
It's funny. I'm actually proud of myself that I can still be a big Springsteen fan, even though I totally disagree with his politics. And it's the same thing with De Niro. De Niro is one of my favorite actors, and who's worse than
Yeah,
him when it comes to
good luck with that. Okay.
the politics. But so, what are Bob Dylan's politics? Do you think?
Dylan was actually very conservative in the early years.
Yeah. Yeah, really interesting. Actually, Infidels is one of my favorite album of his. That was kind of in my prime
Mhm.
rock music days when that album came out. I love that album. But yeah, I've heard comments from him before where he doesn't seem to like being associated with the radical leftist movement of the 60s, but he most certainly is. I mean, you ask your average person, they would identify him as probably one of the leading figures of the social movement of the 60s, right?
Well, Dylan was good at writing about whatever was going on around him. The times are changing, blowing in the wind. Whatever was happening, he could write about the songs. He wrote songs that spoke to the times, but it didn't mean that he was someone that wanted to be political or be part of a political movement. He really was all about the music, and he still is to this day.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, just incredible songwriter. So, big film coming out,
Yeah,
a Hollywood film about his life. Uh,
it's my new movie. You want to still
well,
keep talking Dylan? Yeah, you go see the new Dylan film. None of them are as good as my insider films on Bob Dylan, called Bob Dylan 1966 World Tour: The Home Movies.
opinion on that.
I think when Hollywood tries to depict Dylan, it tends to be kind of shallow. They really don't understand the depth of the man, the depth of his music, his struggles. They tend to be pretty shallow depictions. So I'm not expecting too much out of that movie.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping for more. I was very excited when I heard about it, but hopefully people will check out your documentaries first. So on to the subject at hand, which
Yeah.
is the climate according to AI Al Gore. And there it is there, and we'll give you plenty of opportunities to plug it and tell people how to find the film. I think they're going to be really interested to check it out, especially after hearing this interview. There's a lot of elements I want to cover with you, but let's start with the AI element. In the trailer, you're able to see some of the interview that you do with Al Gore, but and it looks like it's Al Gore talking to you, and it's not, like an animated Al Gore. It's like the real Al Gore having a conversation with you. So tell us how you're able to do that. And I'm also curious about some conversations you must have had with lawyers about that.
Yeah, well, the way I decided to do, I call it it's a climate according to AI Al Gore, because I started out by deciding to research Al Gore's climate science, because he came onto the scene in 1992 with this book called Earth in the Balance. It was this climate manifesto. There's a climate apocalypse. We have to change the way we live. There's a climate emergency and so on. And the premise of his climate science was that there's too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Man is putting more into it, and it's going to doom the planet. We're all going to die. And he admitted he was no scientist, but he always said in that book, and also in his film An Inconvenient Truth from 2006, he spent a lot of time saying that I got my science from a course I took at Harvard when I was a senior for 3 months from a professor named Roger Revelle, who was a scientist. And no one ever really looked into it. So I decided to go to the archives of his Harvard professor, Roger Revelle, at the University of California, San Diego. And I actually found out that, number one, the course that Al Gore took with Roger Revelle was called Human Populations. It was about the world population explosion. It had nothing to do with climate, nothing to do with atmospheric science, nothing. The final exam, reading list, lecture list, nothing about the climate at all. So I looked at what Roger Revelle had done in the climate science field, and all he had done is taken some measurements of carbon dioxide, and he concluded repeatedly over many years, he said, there's only a little bit extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's only 1/3 of 1% of all gas is carbon dioxide. And he said, even if we doubled or tripled it, it wouldn't have any effect on the weather because it's absorbed by the plants. Carbon dioxide is plant food. It gets absorbed by the plants in the ocean. The plants grow taller. You get more crops, greener deserts. So I realized that Al Gore lied about getting his climate science from his Harvard professor. And I
What
decided
was Revelle a professor of?
he was a professor of, he was a scientist, but he taught a class called Human Population about population growth. He never taught climate or climate science. He is someone who had done climate research, but he never agreed with anything Al Gore said. So what I did is once I found this out, I wrote an email to Al Gore saying, I have researched your Harvard professor. And by the way, when Gore was running for vice president in 92, he actually got caught because they asked him in the debate, they asked him, hey, your mentor, Roger Revelle, does not agree with what you're saying about climate science, that there's an apocalypse coming. And Al Gore lies right on TV. He says, oh, Roger Revelle was misquoted. Complete lie. So I email Al Gore and I say, hey, I've researched your professor. I want to talk to you about Roger Revelle and climate science. And he doesn't email me back. Now, he knows me because I worked for him as a student intern when he was a U.S. Senator from Tennessee. I worked in his office and I knew him. I even ran into him in the airport a few years back in Nashville, flying out to LA, and I sat next to him on the plane. So he knows who I am. He doesn't respond. So I realized, I said, wait a minute. I could recreate Al Gore with voice and video. It'll look just like him and sound like him, and actually have an honest conversation about his life history and the climate. So it makes it very entertaining and interesting, because there have been other movies about the climate hoax, but they tend to be kind of lectures and a lot of talking heads, not really entertaining. So I think that's what makes this film so much fun and really makes it relatable to so many people.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about the technology behind what you did, and then I do want to get into, of course, the climate change, what I consider to be a hoax, and it appears you certainly share the same view. But so, from a technology standpoint, what were you using that allows you to feel like you're looking at the actual Al Gore speaking?
Yeah, the AI technology has advanced so much in the last even 1 or 2 years that there are companies where you can upload a voice sample of, say, 5 minutes of Al Gore talking, and then after that, you can just punch in text and you'll get the audio back that sounds exactly like Al Gore. You can do that with anybody, with me, you, with Donald Trump. And they have the same thing for video. You can give them a video sample and it'll sync up to the audio, and that's what makes the movie so much fun.
And what did your lawyers say about that? Were there all kinds of disclaimers you had to make sure you
No,
put at
not
the
really.
beginning of
My
the
lawyer,
movie?
well, my lawyer looked at it and he said, you make it clear, very clear it's not really Al Gore, so you're not liable. You're not saying it's the real Al Gore. But he did say, don't take this as legal advice because it's never been tested in the courts. So
Uh-huh.
we'll see if this becomes a test case, but I don't think it will.
Yeah. Well, there's the fair use doctrines and so on, but as you know, here in Hollywood, we've had some big strikes over AI and the use of actors and their likeness and this and that. And an actor doesn't want to appear in one movie, and then suddenly the
Yeah.
studio can create 20 AI versions of them for the next for the sequel. So hopefully your movie's not a test case.
I hope not. I think, with public figures like Al Gore, you have a great deal of leeway. And as I said, I make it very clear it's not really Al Gore, but you'll find that from all my research, I read 6 biographies of Al Gore's life, hundreds of articles and interviews. It really is a great depiction of the true story of Al Gore's life history and his climate science.
Yeah. So basically, you're able to script out an interview that you did with him, and in the interview, Al Gore kind of comes clean, right? And he kind of acknowledges a lot of the ththings that you discovered in your research.
Yeah, he talks about his life history. A lot of it are things that he's actually said. And then I kind of break him down by confronting him with my research that he did not get any climate science from his Harvard professor, Roger Revelle, that he lied about it. And I actually did more research because I asked myself, if he didn't get this climate science from Roger Revelle, where did he get it from? And I looked into his time at Divinity School. Al Gore, to get out of serving in Vietnam War, he applied to and went to Divinity School in Nashville called Vanderbilt Divinity School. It was a draft dodger's haven where they had these radical environmental professors teaching the students, and where I found this book that Al Gore read. It was on his reading list, called Our Plundered Planet. And this was a wacky book from the late 1940s that was kind of an answer to the nuclear age. It essentially said, don't worry about, the whole world blowing up from nuclear weapons because humanity is ruining the earth. The earth is perfect, it's pristine, and humanity came along and is chopping down trees and using up all the resources, and we're all going to die anyway. And what I did is I read this book and I compared it to Earth in the Balance, and I realized that Gore just rewrote this book for Earth in the Balance. He called it a spiritual crisis. We got to change the way we live. You can't use technology. Exact copy, word for word, of Our Plundered Planet. So what I realized, and what I confront AI Al Gore with in the film, is that when he came out with his climate manifesto, this apocalypse book, he couldn't say, I got this from my environmental professors at Divinity School, or I copied a wacky book from the 40s. He would have been laughed off. So he lied and said, oh, I got this from Harvard, just you should listen to me. So that's a major revelation, and I think it blows the lid off of climate science, because the very premise of climate science is there's too much carbon dioxide. When we burn fossil fuels, it's going to trap in the atmosphere and heat up the earth. We're all going to have an apocalypse. We learned from the film and from the AI Al Gore that carbon dioxide is our friend. We need more of it, not less. The more you put in the atmosphere, the more the plants grow taller, the more the deserts become green. Carbon dioxide is 1/3 of 1% of gas in the atmosphere. It has no effect on temperature. Temperature, in fact, is controlled by the tilt of the earth, sunspots, volcanoes, ocean flows. All these things, 100 factors affect temperature. Carbon dioxide does not. Yet we have these climate policies worldwide where there's trillions being spent on cutting back on using fossil fuels and anything that uses or produces carbon dioxide. So I think it's a major film, and when people see it, they say, wow, I think I just got deprogrammed.
Yeah. So carbon dioxide, that's what all of global warming, climate change is based upon, is this belief that has been increased. Because you hear about other gases like methane and this and that. Is methane just something that supposedly releases carbon dioxide?
No, it's all introduced by Al Gore. Al Gore is the godfather of the climate movement, and he introduced this idea that this same thing from our plundered planet, that gasoline engines are producing carbon dioxide, and we're destroying the earth by cutting down trees, and we have to stop using technology, and humanity is going to ruin the earth by using technology and by growing. So this is what Al Gore copied, and he introduced this idea. He would always say we have to cut down carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases without even saying what they were. And that's what the climate movement is based on, cutting back on passenger cars, cutting back on usage of fossil fuels in farming, and it's depressing the economies of all these Western countries. So I conclude, and I show in the film, that this whole climate science thing is just another attack on the free market system. It's the same old gang that is using climate science to attack the free market system and force socialist solutions upon Americans and others around the world that no one would ever vote for. So it's a giant scam that's got trillions of dollars paying off scientists, paying off all these programs for people to agree that this is real. But any real scientist will tell you there's nothing to climate change, there's nothing to global warming. You'll remember that Gore introduced this subject in 1992 as global warming. But the earth kept getting colder, winters kept getting colder. They would have these climate conferences in Europe, and they couldn't start them on time because the airports were snowed in. So by 2007 or 8, they realized no one was buying into this nonsense. So they changed the terminology to climate change so that whenever there was a weather event, there could be 120 degrees in Las Vegas in July, and Al Gore would say, "You see, there's climate change. There'd be a hurricane in September in the Gulf of Mexico. Oh, that's climate change." Everything became climate change so that you can never really disprove it. So that's part of the subterfuge of forcing this climate change agenda on everyone that people are somehow feeling guilty about. Oh, I got to get an electric car and so on because they want to save the planet. But I think this film shows that it's complete nonsense. And by the way, you can watch the movie trailer or hook up to where to get the DVD or watch the movie online at climatealgore.com.
Yeah, here's my very unsophisticated analysis because I'm no scientist, but I've done a few interviews about this and thought about it. But let's see how well you can see this. Oh,
Yeah,
the thing is shining on my lobe too much. Let me turn this away for a second, okay?
that looks good.
Because what I just find humorous is if you look at a globe, look at that. Do you see any land there at all? That's like half of the planet right there is water. Of course, we know that a grand total of what is it, about 75% of the earth is water. And then the parts of land that actually produce significant amount of carbon dioxide, you could put a little, maybe a pin at the various spots. So maybe you put a pin in Los Angeles and you put a pin in New York and then Pittsburgh and so on. But you put these pins, right? And this is where the carbon dioxide is supposedly spewing out of, and somehow changing the temperature of this entire planet that is mostly water, and it just seems totally absurd to me.
Right. Carbon dioxide is a good gas. We produce it when we exhale, and the plants breathe it in. It's plant food, and they exhale oxygen. So this is something you can ask any climate warrior, how much percentage of carbon dioxide is right now in the atmosphere, and how much would endanger us. They could not even tell you. The climate warriors have turned into this kind of religion where they simply believe in climate science and refuse to accept that anybody even questions it. Uh, that's why they say 97% of scientists agree, because they want to dissuade you from asking questions. But most of them are paid by the UN, universities, green organizations to agree with this climate change theory. So, even people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's kind of popular now as conservatives, I've got him in the movie. He's on tape. He says, "I believe climate skeptics belong in jail with war criminals," because it has been kind of a religion with them, because they believe all of humanity are original sinners. We're sinners because we use fossil fuels, we use electricity, so we're original sinners. And the only way to gain salvation is through sustainability. So if you buy an electric car, you're good. If you don't, you're bad. So a lot of education is needed to combat, and I think this movie goes a long way to debunking the whole climate change narrative.
Yeah, I mean, if you can take out one of the leaders and show that he basically made it all up or it was all very calculating for him at the time, that's very helpful. I guess one question would be, where does Al Gore really stand today when you look at the leaders of the worldwide climate change movement? Because it's gone so far beyond Al Gore at this point.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about why he got into this subject, and I go into this in the film. It's because his father was a U.S. Senator from Tennessee. Al Gore was born in Washington. He's a creature of Washington. His parents raised him to be president one day. He had to accept their ambitions for him. He ran for U.S. Congress in 1976, and he quickly realized he did not have a personality for politics. He had no charisma. He was a terrible speaker, and he wasn't a very friendly person that people could relate to at all. So he realized to fulfill his parents' ambitions to become president, he had to create issues where he could get people to vote for him and follow him because he had an issue that they liked. So he actually made himself into an arms control expert in the 80s during the Cold War. And he put together a proposal for settling the Cold War and the Soviet Union. The Russians invited him over to Moscow, and they were negotiating with Al Gore. And Ronald Reagan, of course, won the Cold War and completely ignored Al Gore. That's when late 80s, when I was working for Al Gore in the US Senate, is when he turned to environmentalism as his next issue to get voters to support him because he thought environmentalism was an issue that crossed all class lines. Democrats were particularly concerned about the environment. There had been the Chernobyl disaster and the Exxon Valdez spill. So that's why he came up with this wacky book called Earth in the Balance that he completely misrepresented and made up the science. He lied about where it came from. He plagiarized an old book from the 40s. Uh, and it was so extreme that he even stopped talking about it when he was vice president with Clinton. When he ran for president in 2000 with George Bush, he didn't say one word about the climate or the environment. It was only 6 years later when he came out with his film, An Inconvenient Truth, that the movement completely took off. And Gore went with it. He became the world's first carbon billionaire. He made hundreds of millions of dollars on the board of Apple and Google and doing all these climate projects with the US government.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about his wealth because that's one of the critiques you hear about Gore is that he basically used this to get rich. So, I mean, sounds like you're saying he initially got into it more for political reasons, but
Correct.
ultimately turned it into a nice little business for himself.
Correct. But he remains the godfather of the climate movement. He invented it, and political interests with political agendas have kind of taken it over to produce these socialist solutions and redistribution of wealth from wealthy countries to poor countries that no one would have voted for. It's the same people, the depopulation crowd, the communists, they've all morphed into climate warriors because they can try to convince people that, well, to save the planet for the good of your children in the future, you need to agree to massive socialist goals that no one would
Yeah.
ever agree to if they're being honest about what it's really all about.
So where do you put Gore in that, as far as using this as a way to implement essentially global socialism, redistribution of wealth from the rich countries to the poor countries, which clearly seems to be part of this plan. I mean, China's allowed to continue to build all these coal plants because it's considered a developing nation while the U.S. isn't supposed to, et cetera. So it's a worldwide redistribution of wealth program. But there's also lots of people who aren't aware of that. They're true believers. They genuinely believe that oceans are rising and this is a problem. So where do you put Al Gore in that?
Look, every prediction Al Gore ever made was a complete bust. The oceans were not rising, the polar ice caps were not melting. We didn't have 5 years to live or 7 years to live. The cities in low-lying areas were not flooded. I think Al Gore got trapped by his own narrative and by all the massive amount of money that he made off of his narrative, such that he shows up at these climate conferences screaming like a maniac about how there was a monsoon in India. There was a tornado in Kansas. as if normal seasonal weather somehow represents climate change. I think he's a prisoner of his own narrative today because everything he's ever said turned out to be false. And he's just doesn't have the courage, or maybe doesn't want to give up the lifestyle to admit that everything he ever said was false. Nothing came true. And what I show in my film, The Climate According to AI Al Gore, is the original story, the original premise that launched the climate movement, that carbon dioxide is dangerous and that when we put it into the atmosphere, we're dooming the planet. Total nonsense. We need more carbon dioxide. The Earth has relatively low amount compared historically. And the more we put in the atmosphere, the larger the trees will get, the more crops we get, the greener the deserts get. It has no effect on weather whatsoever. And that's what Al Gore has never come to grips with.
Yeah, he doesn't really strike me as being a socialist necessarily, like some of the others that are clearly using the climate change hoax to implement the global socialism. Gore strikes me more as a true believer in this climate change.
Oh,
What do you think?
I think he's a prisoner of the narrative he created. He cannot years later say, okay, everything I ever told you was a bust. Earth is not warming. The Earth did not warm. The ice caps did not melt. When I told you in 1992 that we had 7 years to go before the cities are going to flood, he doesn't have the political courage or the personal courage to say everything I said is false, and I guess I should give back the $1 billion I made off of you. So he shows up at these climate conferences ranting like a maniac about how there's a snowstorm in Boston in the winter. There's rain. It rained. It rained in New York City in the summer. So this is the kind of crazy stuff. You can't take even any weather event, even over 25 years, and make a conclusion about it because there's long-term trends. The Earth has been warming and cooling for millions of years, and carbon dioxide has no effect on the climate whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, I think there's some obvious things that demonstrated the fact that most of these guys hang out on yachts and fly around in private jets and buy oceanfront homes. So if it really was that big of a problem, I don't think they'd be doing that. You got Biden encouraging Saudi Arabia and Venezuela to drill, but while stopping the U.S. from drilling. But supposedly this is a global problem. And then you've got the fact that we allowed China to continue to open up all these coal plants while we're not allowed to do any of it. But if it's a climate problem, then it doesn't matter where the carbon dioxide is coming from, right?
But there's no end of hypocrisy. They've had these climate conferences since 1992, and in order to get an agreement and agree on climate goals, they always let the third world countries off the hook. So China and India don't have to do anything. I actually was in Australia screening my film, The Climate According to AI Al Gore, in October. And when I was in Canberra, I screened it at the Federal Parliament building and managed to have dinner with the Russian ambassador to Australia. And I asked him, well, what is Russia doing in terms of climate goals? He said, well, in 2060, we're going to take a look at it. So the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, all the BRICS countries are kind of laughing at how the Western countries are undermining their own economies in order to achieve these climate goals, which will have no effect because the atmosphere goes around the Earth. So if India and China and all these other countries don't participate, the whole thing is a waste of time anyway. But they don't tell us that.
Well, you and I live in the most absurd area, perhaps anywhere in the world, which is California, in what we're doing to shoot ourselves in the foot when it comes to energy and cost of electricity and mandates for solar and for wind and so on. And we just unilaterally implement them, causing our energy prices to go through the roof without requiring any corollary deal with China. So I've read before that about 25% of the pollution in California comes from China. Newsom and his buddies up in Sacramento keep implementing all these climate change regulations on us, but they don't ask for China to do anything to match it.
Yeah, there's just no end of hypocrisy. The UN has been complicit in making things up. They've been caught before, uh, alternating the data to fit the climate narrative. We've got universities like the Columbia University has a climate college, green organizations. Biden did this thing called the Inflation Reduction Act, which he later admitted was a climate bill, $300 billion climate bill. So with these billions and now trillions of dollars worldwide to keep this narrative going, you've got newspapers, big tech, even the trailer for this movie, which is on YouTube. There's a YouTube put in a disclaimer right below my trailer. It says the UN has determined that humans are producing carbon dioxide and that is harming the climate, you know? So you almost can't do anything today without it running through this narrative that Al Gore created originally 1992 in Earth in the Balance, this false idea of what carbon dioxide is and what it does to the atmosphere. And I have shown in my research that he simply rewrote this wacky book from the 1940s and produced a false narrative that the entire world now buys into.
Yeah, well, you're lucky that that's all YouTube is doing right now, because we know what they were doing during COVID as far as censorship. And if you go
Yeah.
against left-wing politics, YouTube will shut you down. And climate change is right there as far as one of the things that you don't dare speak out against, but we need more voices speaking out against it. And appreciate what you're doing. What is your hope as far as what impact this will have on U.S. politics?
Well, I think this film release date is December 10 and had a successful screening tour in Australia. It's going to be available on DVD and on streaming worldwide on many different platforms. And for example, I was in Australia, and after one screening, an 18-year-old girl came up to me and said she's been inundated with this climate hysteria and climate fear her entire schooling from elementary school. And she said, now that I've seen your film, now I realize it was just based on one man who made it up. And I feel like I just got deprogrammed. And that was just from watching the movie. So I think it has a lot of potential. And the restrictions and amount of money going into the climate narrative is so overwhelming. I think people now are willing to hear an alternative message because we haven't had one until now.
Yeah, tide's starting to turn on a few things like DEI and wokeness. I haven't seen the tide start to turn on climate change yet, but hopefully this will be part of the beginning along with Trump's election. But yeah, I'm hearing more and more now universities have a mandated course on sustainability. And of course, we know what's going to be taught at that. A lot of propaganda, but the more things out, like your film, makes it a little bit harder for them to get away with that.
I think so. I think
Yeah.
so. Anyway, the climate, according to AI Al Gore, it's based on a tremendous amount of research in the archives into climate science. I'll tell you an interesting story that I really didn't understand an argument that I had with Al Gore when I worked for him until I made this film. I'll tell you what it is. He invited the interns into his office to kind of get together and talk. And he said, I'm going to open the floor for questions, which is kind of weird. And a girl asked him, what do we do to stop terrorism in the Middle East? There's been some terrorism in Israel. What should the US policy be? And Gore goes into about a 5-minute speech about negotiating. You got to negotiate everything, have a negotiating table, and come to a negotiation, you know. And I said, no, Senator Gore, I think what she's asking is, what should the US policy be to deter terrorism? What should our policy be that would stop terrorism in the first place? And he turns it over to me and he says, what would you do? Just bomb everybody? Like yells at me. I couldn't believe it. It was like shocked. So I said, well, Senator Gore, I don't know what I would do, but when I'm a US Senator one day, I'll have a policy. And he was like shocked. Everybody was shocked. I felt bad about it. But once he got in the US Senate, when his book came out, he would invite climate scientists to the Senate hearings who were skeptics and did not believe in what Al Gore was saying. And Gore would attack them and say, oh, you're just working for OPEC. You're just like the cigarette manufacturers in the 50s that said that cigarette smoking was good and the planet is doomed and you work for the oil companies. So that when I made this film, I realized that if you disagree with Al Gore, he just attacks you and he won't engage in an actual dialogue based on facts. And that's what you learn in this film. And that's what climate science became. You're a denier if you don't agree with their version of climate science, which actually has no basis in science. So I think the film goes a long way in explaining all of this.
Oh yeah, no, you're a caveman if you don't believe in climate change. So we need more things like yours. There's also something called the Inconvenient Truth. Is a pretty great app that I have on my phone that people should check out. But the AI Al Gore coming to a streaming service near you. And Joel Gilbert, we thank you so much for coming on the Power Hour. People can check out the trailer right now on YouTube and start streaming it in just a couple weeks.
Okay, climatealgore.com. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Joel. And thank everybody for watching and listening to another Power Hour. I'm James Breslo, your host. Take care, everybody.
Cheers.